I thought, yeah, I talked to her Jamming, but he put that in place. There is a great public anywhere, he put it in the part that.
Okay. Good evening. This is part 5 of our series on the 8th chapter of Bava. We are going to be on the bottom of 84b and the top of 85a this evening. I realized that I had, for some reason this fall, been putting out the source packets in a much smaller font size than I had been in the past. So I changed it back to what it used to be. If people don't like it this way or whatever, you can send me an email and let me know. I like to be able to actually see the words. Okay, so we are continuing in our analysis of the payments that you pay if you injure a person, and we had said that there were 5 payments in the Mishnah. The first was nezek, and we spent most of our analysis time about nezek talking about the question of whether there indeed should be a payment for nezek at all, because nezek sounded in the Torah like the way you were supposed to respond to having caused permanent damage to someone else's body was by having bits chopped off of your own body. And so we spent a couple of pages of Gemara on deriving that, in fact, what that means is you're supposed to pay for the damage that you did. Now we are at our second payment, which is tsar, which is more or less a payment for the physical pain and suffering caused. After that, we will go on to ripui, which is more or less payment for medical expenses, and then shevet, which is emotional pain, something like that, and then shevet, which is going to be unemployment, although unemployment is going to mean something a little different than you might anticipate. Okay, in any case, for tonight, we're dealing with tsar, and the Mishnah had said about tsar that the sort of example of a case was if somebody had been burned with a something pointy in a place where it doesn't make a mark. So we are actually going to go off to begin with on a tangent on the question of whether there is also a payment for tsar in a case where it did make a mark, or whether tsar is I guess the real question is tsar an alternative to paying for damage, or is it in addition to paying for damage? Okay, so because you might think, if you thought it was only in cases where you don't make a mark, you would say, well, okay, if you actually damage the person's body, then you pay for that. If not, then, well, I guess we can't charge you for damage because you didn't do any, so we'll charge you for pain instead. But we are going to take the other side, which is that it's additional. Okay, in any case, so we start starting from the second line here, because I just summarized the first line, which is the quote from the Mishnah. Tsar shalab makom nezek mishtale. Tsar, even if it is together with nezek, gets paid. And I don't know if you can distinguish between whether that means even if the pain was caused in connection with damage, and even if the pain was paid for, even if the damage was paid for, you still have to pay for the pain. Let's assume for right now that it means both, unless it turns out to make a difference later. But so we are asserting that our Mishnah, by listing pain after nezek, is indicating that you, and by at the beginning saying you pay 5 things, is telling us that in fact you can pay these things for the same injury, both nezek and tsar. So in that case, man Tana. So who is the Tana who holds the position that you can have an obligation to pay for pain in the same case where you would have the obligation to pay for damage. Amar Rava ben Azai. The Rava says it's ben Azai. And now we are going to go down a little bit of a rabbit hole of a Braita in which we have a machloket between ben Azai and Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. And it's not entirely clear what either of them is saying or why they're saying it. So as I said, we're gonna spend some time analyzing that. But ultimately, our goal is around figuring out who is it that believes that there is a payment for tsar, both in a case where there is no permanent damage to the body and in a case where there is permanent damage to the body. Okay, Ditai. Rebbe Omer, Kviya Nemra Tchila. Rebbe says, well, we should read the pasuk first. Rebbe says that burn was said first, which is a very strange thing to say, but let's at least have the pasuk in front of us so you can see how bizarre it is. We are in Shmot 21:25, a pasuk that we have consulted a number of times before, in Parshat Mishpatim. And yeah, that's the wrong page. Sorry. And here we are. So, and it's a very short pasuk. It says almost nothing. It says kivya tachat kivya, a burn in place of a burn. Petza tachat patza, a petza and chabura are both somewhat vague words, but I'm going to try to be consistent about how I translate them. A bruise in place of a bruise, and chabura tachat chabura, a wound in place of a wound. And so when Rebbe and Ben Azai say it said burn first or it said wound first, presumably they do not mean, as you might otherwise suspect, that what they're trying to change the order of the words in the Torah. I think that is not a plausible interpretation. So they must mean something else, which means we have to figure out, to begin with, what it is that they said, and then we can figure out why they said it, and then we can figure out if one or the other of them is compatible with our Mishnah. Okay, so Rebbe says the content of what he says is kviya ne'emra tchila. The burn was said first. Ben Azai omer chabura ne'emra tchila. Ben Azai says wound was said first. So the Gemara very reasonably says, what in the world is going on here? Okay, what are they talking about, arguing about? Rebbe Savar, kviya deleit ba chabura mashma. Rebbe thinks that a kviya, a burn, the normal meaning of a burn is a burn that doesn't make a mark, is a permanent mark on the body. So that's what the word kivya would mean if you didn't modify it further. And then katav rachmana chabura ligluye ala de kviya d'itba chabura in ilolo. And then the sentence goes on and it says a wound for a wound. And Rebbe says that is the Torah commenting on itself and saying that that word I already said, you should only take that in a context in which it fits this description. So a kvi'ah, a burn that has a mark, that makes it mark, that there should be a payment for. And a burn that doesn't make a wound, you should not have a payment for. And that's why it says burn. If it just said burn, I would think that was just a burn. Then it says wounds. Now I think it means it has to be both. So Rebbe says, sorry, there's no payment for a burn that doesn't make a mark. And since a burn that doesn't make a mark causes pain, if it has no payment, that presumably means that there's no payment for pain if it doesn't make a mark. Okay, so far so good. Ben Azai Savar, and the other side is Ben Azai says, Kvi'ah deleit ba chabura mashma. He thinks that then standard meaning, the normal meaning of burn is a burn that in fact does come with a wound. Right? So we might say that Rebbe's default burn is like a first degree burn, and Ben Azai's default burn is like a third degree burn. And then we're modifying away from wherever it is we started from. So Ben Azai says this: the default burn is one that does come with a wound, and Katav Rachmana Chabura Ligluye Ale de Kvia Deleit Chabura. And then God put wound on the list with burn so that you would know that burn and wound are two separate things, and that in fact a burn is something different than a wound. So it doesn't have to have any, it doesn't have to have a lasting mark. Okay, that was Rava's presentation, and in that presentation, the side that would be like what we want our Mishnah to be, which is to say that if you hurt somebody but don't permanently damage their body, you do pay tsar. That side would be represented by Ben Azai, and that's Rava's position. Okay, Rav Papa does not like that at all. Mat kifla Rav Papa. Adarabba ipcha mitztabra. Rav Papa says, I'm sorry, but the exact opposite of what you said, Rava, makes more sense. And here is his interpretation of the dispute between Rebbe and Ben Azai. Rebbe Omer, Kvia ne'emrat tchila. Rebbe says that burn was said first. Katav Rachmana, Chabura, ligluye Allah, de Kvia deleit ba Chabura. So when Rebbe said a burn was said first, what he meant by that was that the burn is there by itself at the beginning of the pasuk, meaning a second or third degree burn, a burn that does make a permanent mark. And then God wrote the word wound to modify backwards and tell me that the burn didn't have a wound. And Ben Azai Omer, Chabura ne'emrat tchila. Ben Azai says a wound was said first. Savar, he thinks, Kvia deleit ba Chabura mashma, that when the burn was there at the beginning, that meant without a wound. Katav Rachmana Chabura Gluye Ale de Kvia Diipe Chaburain Ilolo. And when the Torah then said wound, that was to tell me that a burn is only a burn if it has a wound. But basically what Rav Papa did was to take everything Rava said and read it backwards and just switch the names on the two positions. Which is fine, except now how do you associate those positions with it said burn first, it said wound first, because Rava had reasonably explained that. Then Rav Papa says v'amaskana kain, and Rav Papa says, and in fact, when they say what was said first, what they mean is what the meaning is of burn at the end in the conclusion. So they don't really mean that it was first; they mean it was the primary. So the meaning of burn is burn without a wound, or the meaning of burn is burn with a wound, not that was what was there first and then it was changed. Inami, alternatively, the kule alma kvi'a bein di'it b'chabura bein deleit b'chabura mash. So now we have a totally different way of reading the whole machloket. Alternatively, everybody agrees that the meaning of the word burn is always that it both ways. It doesn't mean either one. It could be a first degree burn, second degree burn, third degree burn with a permanent damage, not permanent damage, whatever. Burn just means it got hot. Right? That, which might be the interpretation of burn that you and I both would have walked into this class with. And so maybe Ben Azai and Rebbe both start with that as their supposition. And here they are having a different disagreement. And here they're disagreeing about whether you can have a klalu prat which is separated. So first we need to talk about what a klalu prat is. A klalu prat is when you have a description of a rule in which you first use a word which seems to describe a larger category, in which the Torah first uses a word that seems to describe a larger category, and then the Torah uses another word that seems to describe a smaller category, that is a detailed version of the first word. The rule is that you have to assume that the second word is modifying the first word, and that the whole law only applies to the more detailed version. So if we were, for example, to use that here, if we would ignore the actual wording of the pasuk for a second, you could say, well, burn means lots of things. It could mean that it was seriously burned. It could mean that it was mildly burned. It could mean that there's permanent damage. It could mean that there's no damage at all. It just hurts. Anything in between. So burn is a very vague word. And then the Torah referred, if you think it's talking about the same thing, to the same wound as a wound. And wound usually means that there's actual damage to the skin. And you could, so now you have a subcategory. Started out with, it could be any kind of burn. Now we've narrowed it down to it has to be a mark on, or a damage on the skin. And you would say, well, okay, then a burn is only a burn if it caused damage to the skin. That's what would happen if we did a klalu prat here. The problem is, as you may recall, when I read the pasuk, that the words were a burn in place of a burn, a bruise in place of a bruise, a wound in place of a wound. So we've got 3 extra words stuck in the middle of the pasuk. It's not that far apart, it's 3 words away, but the words are not exactly consecutive, and they're not consecutive items on the list. So the question now is, suppose that both Rebbe and Ben Azai think that the default meaning of a burn is it could be any kind of burn, with or without permanent damage. And now the question is, do we assume that the word chabura, which is 3 words away from the word kiviyah, has to be modifying kiviyah and saying that it's only the kind of burn that makes a mark? Or do we say, no, that there's other words in between? I'm sorry, but that's not part of the same thing anymore. And that's the machloket that we seem to be having here, right, in our third interpretation of this machloket. According to this now, let's play it out. Rebbe Savar, Ein Danino to bichlalu prat. Rebbe says we don't interpret it using a klalu prat. If we don't interpret it using a klalu prat, then the word burn is going to continue to mean any kind of burn, with or without a mark. Ben Azai Savar, and Ben Azai thinks Danino to bichlalu prat, that we do interpret it using a klalu prat. And so Ben Azai is going to say, well, the word wound is modifying the word burn, and it's telling me that a burn is only a burn if it has a wound. And so he is only going to make you pay for burns if they make a permanent mark, cause permanent damage, however we want to read this, to the body. Okay, that is the same layout of who has which position that Rav Papa had. And in this version, it's going to be Rebbe who is the position represented in the Mishnah. It doesn't really matter very much, as long as we always have a Tana who represents the position that's in the Mishnah. For our perspective, from the perspective of understanding this Gemara, it doesn't really matter who agrees with the Mishnah, as long as someone does. Because if we can't find anyone agreeing with the Mishnah, then we have to question whether we interpreted it correctly. Okay. But you might wonder if Rebbe says, I'm not allowed to understand anything about the beginning of the pasuk from the end of the pasuk, right? I can't use the word wound to modify the word burn. Then in that case, what's he doing with the word wound at all? Why is it there in his interpretation? And the Gemara says it says lidamim yitirim. He is reading it so as additional, right? I think what this means is that you might have thought that you pay for either a burn or a wound, and you can't have a situation in which you have to pay for both. And Rebbe is saying, nope, they're both on the list. So this means that if you have a burn that doesn't make a mark, you pay for pain. And if you have a burn that causes permanent damage, then you're going to pay more because you're going to pay for the permanent damage also. And so it makes sense for them to be separate items on the list so that you'll know that there is a possibility of a larger or smaller payment. Okay, now we are going to go back to quoting the Mishnah to try to actually understand what it is the Mishnah was talking about. Because we've just gone off on this tangent about when there are pain payments, but we haven't addressed the question of how you assess a payment for pain, right? We kind of understood how you assess a payment for nezek, for the permanent damage, at least in the presence of a slave market, because people's bodies in the world with slavery, people's bodies have a more or less determined price. And you can find out what they were worth yesterday and what they're worth today, and you can subtract one number from the other, and now you know how much they lost. We don't have anything anywhere near that good for understanding what it costs if you hurt somebody, right? If I poke you, so presumably that caused you pain. Presumably I owe you something, but how in the world do we know how much that is? And the Mishnah was not especially helpful because it said we assess how much a similar person would want to collect to be hurt like this. And that tells us very little about how we would assess it, and we're still not going to get very far on that one in this Gemara. But more importantly, there are some other problems with that, which the Gemara is going to point out. So let's read this Gemara. So, so if you have pain in a place where there's also damage, how do you appraise what the pain costs? Amar Abu Hadishmuel, Omdim Kama Adam Rotzel Litol Liktoa Lo Yada. So Shmuel's father seems to be more or less paraphrasing the Mishnah. He says we assess how much a person would want to collect in order to have his arm amputated. So the Gemara is astounded that you could suggest such a thing. First of all, Liktoa Lo Yado Lo Tsar Lechudehu. First of all, cutting off a person's arm doesn't isolate the payment for pain. Presumably, if you're going to pay me some astounding sum of money to chop off a piece of my body, I am taking into account the fact that I won't have that body part anymore in the amount of money I'm charging you for that. Probably I'm also taking into account the fact that I can't go to work while I'm at the doctor's office, and probably it's also taking into account the fact that I might find it humiliating to watch you throw pieces of my body into the trash. Right? Like it's probably accounting for all of the different outcomes. That's the first problem the Gemara has. Right? Hakulu chamisha dvarim. This is going to include all 5 things. The ode, and the Gemara says, furthermore, bishuftani askinan, are we dealing with idiots here? Like who would take any amount of money to let their arm be chopped off? That's crazy. Somebody who would be willing to take money to get their arm chopped off is almost by definition not similar enough to the person who we are trying to assess that we could call them a person like this. because the whole reason this person is here in court suing is because he didn't want his arm chopped off, which is to say he was a normal person. Normal people will do just about anything to keep their body intact. Okay. So that's not gonna work. Okay, so we are gonna work on the assumption, as we always do, that if an intelligent person said something, it probably meant something smart, and we probably just didn't understand it, which is, by the way, an excellent way to go through life, because well, first of all, you find yourself being nicer to people. And second of all, on the occasions when you've actually misunderstood something, you look like less of an idiot if you say, I don't understand, than if you say you're wrong. That is a lesson I learned from my Rebbe, Rabbi Brofender, and it's a very important lesson. In any case, the Gemara routinely assumes that if something sounds idiotic, it must be that we misunderstood it. Okay, so we're gonna try again. Let's try a new interpretation of what Shmuel's father meant. Ella liktoa yado hakatua. So maybe what Shmuel's father meant was to amputate an already amputated arm, which is to say you had some sort of tragic accident in which a body part got destroyed but not quite severed, and it's not useful, and it's going to hurt to get it cut off. So you're not really paying the person to like lose their arm. You're paying the person to undergo the pain of the surgery, but they already don't have a usable arm. So maybe that could segregate the amount of money that the pain would be worth, because now we've gotten rid of the destruction of the arm. That happened already. That's not relevant to our case. It might even get rid of the payment for the medical care and the unemployment, depending on whether the original injury is already causing so much damage that this is actually going to improve your medical situation. That's not clear to me. But in any case, it removes the problem that you're destroying a limb, because the limb already has already been destroyed in this version. But the Gemara says, nope, that's not going to work either. Yadoha katua nami lo tsar lehudeika. The already amputated arm is also not just isolating the payment for the pain, because whatever he's going to demand to be paid for that is also going to take into account his boshet, which, as we said before, boshet is the emotional distress, emotional damages. Because de kasifa le milta le mishka bisra le mashte leklavim, because it's embarrassing to have pieces of your body cut off and thrown to dogs. I actually have never experienced that. I'll take their word for it. But I maybe it's culturally dependent, maybe not, but apparently it's demeaning. Okay, so we need a case in which the amount of money that you would demand to be paid would not include demanding to be paid for the fact that the limb is actually going to be removed from your body. Even if it doesn't work anymore, we still think that that is something you would demand extra payment for. So we're going to have to exclude that. Okay, so we're going to try again. Ella, kama adam rotze litol liktoa lo yado hamuchtav lemalchut ben sam l'sayif. So instead, maybe what Shmuel's father meant was that we are going to assess how much a person would want to receive, want to collect, to have his arm amputated if his arm had already been condemned by the government, and the government was anyway going to chemically destroy his arm, and you're paying him to agree to have it chopped off with a sword instead of destroyed chemically. Now, we need to assume here, as the Gemara is assuming, and I'm not sure this is realistic, but it doesn't really matter, because the whole case at this point has kind of gone off the rails and realism isn't really an option anymore. But we need to assume that destroying a body part chemically doesn't cause physical pain. I suspect that that's not a realistic presentation of what would happen if you used chemicals to destroy a person's arm without actually physically removing it, or for that matter, to make it fall off, but without cutting it. I suspect that would actually still be painful, but I do not have the medical knowledge to know whether what I just said makes sense. And I actually have no idea whether this is something that could plausibly have been threatened by a government in the time of the Gemara, or whether this is just entirely a flight of fancy. I have no idea. Let's pretend it's a flight of fancy and assume that it one way is painless and the other is painful, because that's the best I can do at the moment. Okay, so what we have here then is a person whose the powers that be have decided that they are going to remove his arm in a way that's painless, and you want to pay him to have his arm removed instead in a way that's going to be painful. I don't know why you want to pay him to do that. Nobody seems interested in that question. But the question is, how much would you have to pay him for him to be willing to accept that pain? So the Gemara responds, Amri, hachanami lo shakil mitzari nafshe. I'm sorry, but this is still not going to work, because nobody would take, at least nobody sane would take any amount of money for that proposition. Then we're apparently not asking why would you want to pay him to experience the pain, but we are, from his perspective, saying, the fact that he's going to lose his arm notwithstanding, he's not going to be interested in taking money to experience pain. That's wacky. Okay. Ella, so instead, one more try, and this is the one that's going to work. Omdim kama adam rotzeh litain liktoa lo yado hamuchtav l'malchut ben saif l'sam. Okay, so now we have the same case almost. We have a person whose arm has been condemned by the evil regime. The evil regime is going to chop your arm off. God forbid, but going to chop somebody's arm off. And the question is, how much of a bribe would the victim be willing to pay to have it done chemically and painlessly instead of with a sword? And now we have approached an amount of money that the pain is worth. Not the amount of money that you would have to pay someone to experience it, but the amount of money someone would be willing to pay to avoid experiencing it. If you want to put this in terms that make sense in the modern universe, but not so much in the Gemara because they don't have the technology, you could say, right, if suppose you have an evil regime that is planning to chop somebody's arm off, how much would that person be willing to pay in bribes to have it done with anesthesia? Right. That's not a question that could have made sense to the Gemara because anesthesia doesn't exist yet. Pain medication that would be effective against that kind of pain doesn't exist yet. But it does now. It's not perfect, but it exists more now than it did then. And so it seems like that would be, we now actually have the technology to have the conversation they're trying to have, but in a concrete way instead of a flight of fancy sort of way. And I think that the equivalent using our technology is, suppose that whatever it is the person did to you is going to happen to you anyway. How much would you pay to get to have anesthesia during the process? Possibly even during the recovery process. I don't know. I'm assuming that the pain here extends through as much pain as this wound is ever going to cause you. So perhaps the anesthesia during the surgery and then the morphine until you recover or whatever. Problem with that is that the Mishnah said we assess how much a person would demand to collect in order to undergo this pain. And we have now changed our case until it's not about the person being injured collecting money. It's about the person being injured paying money to somebody in order to avoid pain, rather than them agreeing to accept money in order to agree to accept pain. So that's a problem. Highly tol litemi bayale. This word litol in the Mishnah, to collect, really needs to be to give in order for the Mishnah to say what we have now decided Shmuel's father must have meant. So Amar of Yehuda Breder of Yoshua, litol ze mizeh mashenatan ze. So he says, this one is going to take from this one what this one gave, which I think what he is saying is that in every transaction, there is a giver and a taker, and he's not that picky about which way the language goes, because it says collect. Yeah, someone's going to collect money, and he's perfectly happy to read it as, sloppy or vague. And yeah, what the executioner is going to collect from you in return for changing the way that he's going to do the arm amputation. Or presumably, this is of course also everything we've said here is also true of any other injury that we might have. They just chose to use amputating an arm as an example. But any kind of injury, the assessment is going to be, what would you pay to, what would a normal person pay to have the same thing happen, but without pain? And that is going to be the amount that they're going to have to pay you, not so much because you agreed to have it happen, as because at the very least you deserve to be paid that because you didn't get the benefit of not having the pain. So you suffered the pain. You should get paid for the pain. Okay, that is what I have for this evening. I realized that some parts of it were not entirely clear, so I would welcome questions so that I can try to fix that.
Okay, this is totally non-understandable.
Which part?
And I looked at it before class and still, okay, so now what was the whole point of going through how we assess how much money this is worth? Because
so I think the idea is that the breakdown of the Mishnah into categories is all fine and good. It makes nice logical sense, except that in real life these things don't happen that way. And if you have the injury, you have all of the different results of it happening to you at once, and they're having trouble isolating just one result so that they can figure out what it costs.
But what we're doing now in terms of the amputation example,
Mhm.
it's not, that's not proving only one of, is that only pain? Is that?
They're certainly trying to make it only pain. They're trying to hold all of the other variables stable by saying you don't have a choice about any of them. And what would you pay to make the pain go away if you can't make any of the other parts of the story go away? That's what they're trying to do.
Okay. And is the point of that, though, to then assess how much would be paid for all the other categories as well and come up with a sum total?
Yeah, the idea in the Mishnah seemed to be that we're going to assess each of the 5 things separately, and then the court is going to give you a bill for, the 5 things added together.
Oh,
That seemed to be what the Mishnah was saying. Although in some cases you won't owe all 5 things, because there might, for example, not be any, unemployment associated with whatever you did.
right.
Or whatever.
And the whole beginning also.
Yeah.
like I didn't understand that when I first read it, what they meant when each one of them meant Ben Azai and Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, what they meant when they said first, but then you explained that it's really just priority, which is the dominant one, right?
Yes, and well, what presumption you start off with is going to affect what you think happens when it gets modified. Or if whether or not you think it is being modified, right? Depending on which version of the machloket you have. But yes.
Because when you read the pasuk, I mean, it just seems like these are three different kinds of damages, of burns.
It actually sounds like there are three totally separate cases, right? You got one person with a wound and one person with a bruise and another person with a burn. And we're saying that each of their separate assailants should have to pay them. But it really sounded like they were totally unrelated cases.
Exactly.
But that's not how the Gemara is not choosing to read it that way.
Which is strange, no?
It's not as strange as the fact that they're not interested in what meaning the middle word might have. Like, what if the word petza is trying to modify kviyah? Or what if chabura is modifying petza? Like, I don't feel like we have, if there was a complete analysis of this pasuk, we don't have it.
Yeah.
We have a fragment.
Yeah. Yeah, because I mean, we have that klal and prat in other places too.
Mm-hmm.
But usually it seems a little clearer that one is coming to modify the other.
Well, and usually they're consecutive, which I think is part of that.
Yeah.
Or at least it's clear that they're talking about the same case. Yeah.
Yes, this whole thing is just strange. A little.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Jerry, I agree with your analysis completely. We should take a look at the chat. Roni, do you have a question?
Yeah, I mean, I just have something that's like irking me. So I wonder if you have thoughts on it. Like the assumption that someone would not pay money to get pain inflicted upon them feels totally unrealistic to me.
Well, it might depend on the scale of the pain.
It would depend on the scale, but also, I mean, like there is a number I would put on how much I would be willing to have the pain of my arm getting cut off. Like I would put a number to that. Like that's not, I don't know if that's like a me weird thing or like a universal thing that people like. To me, it feels like that's something that like I could be like, okay, I would be willing to get paid a certain quantity of money to have that happen to me because like, you know, money would be nice to have. And like, I would be willing to undergo that experience to have that kind of money. Right. And like, it makes me kind of wonder what about that, the perspective of the people writing it, like making that assumption makes them assume that no one would pay for that. Because I feel like also like if someone was like super poor, I can imagine someone being like the number changing drastically and being much more willing to like have the pain of having their arm cut off. Like I'm not like low income, but I'm also like not in a place where I'm like super like have all the money I could ever want. And like even in this kind of like weird middle space, I'm totally like I would definitely there's money I would take to have my arm cut off, like with the pain wise, like that. I don't know. So I'm kind of baffled by their assumption that no one would.
It may be that there's variability across humanity on that one. Which some of it may be age related, although I hate to say that, but it may be that young people are more prepared to risk things that they haven't experienced, partly because they're young and brave and partly because they don't know what they're actually risking.
But I mean, like I've been in severe pain in my life. I have a lot of medical issues, unfortunately, right? And like I'm almost, that makes me feel like I'm more prepared because I've been above the 10 in the pain scale already in my life. So I'm like, I've already been it. I might as well do it again. Like, does that make sense? Like, I guess maybe this is a me thing. I don't know.
Well, I think there may be, as I said, some variation between people, And we need, in order for this to be usable as a legal definition, it needs to be the sort of thing where we can find an equivalent for most people who would walk into court. We need to be able to find a person like them who would be willing to say yes. And unless your feeling is very widespread, it doesn't necessarily help.
I don't know. I mean, that's what I'm
Um,
curious about, because to me, I assumed it was wide. I assumed everyone would be willing to put a price on that. But reading this Gemara makes it seem like I'm totally an outlier, which is why I was very perplexed, if that makes sense. Because I assumed my experience was universal, whereas the Gemara is assuming its experience is universal, and I'm not sure who's more right about.
I don't know.
Here. Yeah, I have no idea.
Yeah.
Maybe, potentially we can take a poll, but
Yeah,
do a little survey.
sure. You can take a poll.
There was
who
a
here-
Twilight Zone or a similar kind of show
Mhm.
where the premise is someone is paid to give up his eyes to someone wealthy to have them transplanted into the other person.
So, and in real life, you don't have to go to the Twilight Zone. In real life, people do, when offered the opportunity, sell body parts.
Kidneys.
For sure, kidneys, because you can live without them, but also sometimes body
one.
parts that you can't live without, their own or other people's.
Regardless, I'm sorry, regardless whether there are people willing to have their arm cut off for money, it makes sense, makes more sense to me that you're going to find people willing to pay money or to pay a bribe in order to avoid the pain.
Yeah, I think this certainly the number of people in the second category is larger. The other thing I was going to say is we have a phenomenon now, which I don't know if there's an equivalent in the time of the Gemara, but we have a phenomenon now in which people at least have been known to consider committing suicide in return for large amounts of money, right? You read Death of a Salesman. Of course, just for the record, first of all, that's a bad idea. Don't do that. And second of all, it doesn't work because the insurance companies aren't dumb, right? So, but that does need to be said. But like, I don't think that the play Death of a Salesman is presenting the salesman as crazy or stupid. He's just desperate, right? So yes, people will do some very extreme things for money, but when you're trying to assess the market price of something, the question of whether people will do extreme things in desperate circumstances is sort of not helpful, because what you really need is you need a normative, not emotionally laden market price that everyone can agree is just what everyone would pay. And unfortunately, in a world of a totalitarian regime that is inclined to chop off people's body parts, there probably is a market in bribes to the authorities to do things in a way that's less painful. We know that, we have a story that when Rabbi Hanania ben Tradion is being killed, right, and they're burning him alive, and they have him wrapped in wet cloth so that he'll, live long enough to die of smoke inhalation while being hurt instead of just dying fast. Certainly they offer there is a bribe discussed for removing the wet cloth. I don't actually remember who does or doesn't pay what to whom, but there is an explicit discussion of bribing the executioner there. And it wouldn't surprise me if, unfortunately, if under a totalitarian regime with that kind of public barbaric punishment, if there aren't actually price lists, unfortunately, for that sort of thing, such that you could talk about there being a market price for it, in a way that there isn't ever going to be a market price for this, both because many people would say no, and because who would want to ask them to do it to be like, what's the point? Why bother? Right? Nobody benefits, Roni, from you experiencing horrible pain, such that they would be willing to pay you for it. So that is a problem that Gemara didn't mention, but it seems to me like the real problem, which is that there's no market for this because nobody wants it. Maybe when the Gemara said, "Are we dealing with idiots?" what it meant was the people who would pay the money, not the people who would accept the money. Right? You have that reading open to you, if you'd like, because those people are definitely idiots. Right? Who's going to pay their life savings just to watch someone experience pain? Like, that's nutty.
Well, some of this actually may be academics. Some of the news from Iran is that they're talking about punishing protesters by removing some body parts.
Unfortunately, there are still regimes in the world that punish people by chopping off body parts. Just for the record, I'd like to point out that we, over the last 5 classes, have discovered that there doesn't seem to be a credible source that Jews have ever considered such a thing, despite the fact that everyone accuses us of it. But yeah, there totally are still places in the world where they chop off ears and hands and God knows what else. And I am sure that there is a market price for a bribe for anesthesia there. And for antibiotics and for whatever else you could come up with. We should never have to, actually have direct knowledge. And in fact, hopefully we can get to a place where no one in the world has direct knowledge of such a thing.
Amen.
Okay, so as far as I know, we are meeting next week. And I will see you then. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Deborah.
Okay, good night.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Deborah.